I analysed over 2,000 timed Mythic Plus runs from the top 0.1% of the player base to answer one simple question. How can you build an effective comp around the spec that you actually want to play? Everyone knows what the meta comp is. It dominates tier lists, it is often seen in high key streams. Most of the conversation around Mythic Plus will surround what the best 5 classes to play are. The reality is, though, most players are not trying to build the single best theoretical comp in the world. They're trying to get a good group around a spec that they actually want to play. So today, we're going to break down what makes a successful Mythic Plus comp. Spec synergies, flexible replacements, anchor specs, different compositions, and how to fit the less popular classes into comps in a successful way. First, we do need to touch on the current meta comp because we can actually learn a lot from it. At the moment, the most dominant Mythic Plus comp is Guardian Druid, Mistweaver Monk, Unholy DK, Devourer DH, and Orgavoker. In the top 1,000 runs that I analysed, this exact 5-spec stack made up roughly 27% of all runs. The important part, though, is that it's not just that these specs are strong individually. The most important part is how well they work together. Guardian and Mistweaver together provide the highest healing and damage throughput of any tank healer combo while still being able to live the highest level keys. Demon Hunter and DK DPS are also extremely tanky on their own, with very good damage output and cooldowns that line up neatly with Breath of Aeons from the Orgavoker. Interestingly, in the second batch of 1,000 runs that I analysed, this exact comp only made up 9% of the total runs. So once you move even slightly away from the absolute bleeding edge level of the ladder, comp building becomes a lot more flexible. One of the most interesting shifts was with the healers. Across the entire 2,000 runs, when the comps deviated from the DPS core of Unholy DK, Devourer DH, and Orgavoker, Mistweaver no longer was the most common healer. It was more often replaced with Resto Shaman. This does show us one important thing. Meta picks are not always the best in isolation. Sometimes a spec is only truly meta because of all of the other specs around it. If you change any elements of the comp, suddenly other parts of it don't make as much sense anymore. We'll come back to this idea shortly, but it becomes one of the most important lessons that we can take when building comps around less popular specs. We'll step away from the meta comp now and use the data to work out how successful groups are actually being built around other specs. The first place to look is the tank healer pairing, because across the data, independent of the DPS lineup, many of these successful comps seemed to have a stable pairing of a tank and healer that was fairly consistent across a lot of the runs. From the top 2,000 runs, a handful of dominant tank healer shells emerged. Guardian Druid and Mistweaver Monk made up 788 of the runs. Guardian Druid and Resto Shaman made up 304. Brewmaster Monk and Resto Shaman made up 232. Brewmaster Monk and Restoration Druid made up 157. And Brewmaster Monk and Mistweaver Monk made up 131. Those pairings together were the overwhelming majority of the tank healer combinations, which does show us one thing. Even when the DPS lineup changes, this shell often remains pretty consistent. Discipline Priest was more often paired with Guardian Druid than any other tank. Holy Paladin was paired fairly evenly with Guardian Druid and Brewmaster Monk, but interestingly, it also appeared quite often in Blood Death Knight comps. Blood DK actually showed a fairly broad range of healers in the comps that it was played in. Mistweaver Monk and Resto Shaman was still the most popular, but Discipline Priest and Holy Paladin also made fairly common appearances. This shows, I guess, that Blood DK functions a little bit differently to other tanks, and so the healer combination can be a little bit different as well. For the very uncommon picks, so Protection Paladin, Vengeance, Protection Warrior, Preservoker, and Holy Priest, the pattern was pretty consistent amongst all of these. These specs were usually paired with one of the common counterparts in the other role. Restoration Shaman again showing up more frequently as the healer in these groups. The other interesting detail is the DPS lineup when these less common picks came into place for the tank and healer. These comps would almost always include a fairly durable roster of DPS, so something like a mix of Death Knight, Demon Hunter, Retribution Paladin, Warrior, and Hunter. I think this is probably a lesson that we can take away. When one part of your group, especially in the tank healer department, is a little bit less dominant than the other healers and tanks, it is often a good thing in successful groups to compensate for that by surrounding them with more tanky and utility heavy DPS specs. Moving into the DPS slots, this is where I think the data becomes a lot more interesting. At the absolute top level, the dominant core of Unholy DK, Devourer, and Augmentation Evoker just was pretty much everywhere. In the highest key brackets, these three classes made up roughly 59% of the runs where all three of them were present. So at the very top end, it does get a little bit stagnant. But when we start looking at a broader set of runs, so below the top 1,000, this changed pretty quickly. The full meta DPS core was still pretty common, but it was no longer the only thing that was showing up. Often what was happening instead was a pattern of 2 meta DPS and then 1 flexible replacement. Ret Paladin showed up as one of the more successful flex replacements. It would appear really commonly alongside Death Knight and Demon Hunter, as well as having Restoration Shaman being the primary healer in these groups. The reason for this would be the value that Ret Paladin gets from the Sky Fury buff from a Shaman, but it also shows that it can quite comfortably fit within a semi-off meta structure and succeed to a very, very high level still. Warrior DPS was also an interesting one to look at because it almost made itself into a non-meta anchor. It didn't just appear as like a random flex third DPS like Ret Paladin often did. When groups moved away from DK, Demon Hunter, and Evoker, Warrior would very often become one of the core pieces holding these alternative comps together. It showed up a lot alongside Ret Paladin, Rogue, Hunter, and Feral Druid, with these groups almost always featuring a Brewmaster Monk and a Resto Shaman. We'll touch on this in a moment, but it does reflect that alternative meta comps can also be extremely successful. Demo Warlock looked a little bit different again. It fell fairly squarely in the flex pick category. It would almost always appear alongside the established meta classes of Death Knight, Demon Hunter, or Evoker. So while the Warrior created its own comp identity entirely, Warlock was more so a clean replacement inside these stable comps. Shaman DPS was also a funny one to note. When Shaman appeared as a DPS, the Shaman healer became a lot less common. This does make a lot of sense. Doubling up on class buffs is not always a bad thing, but in this exact situation, I think this is an unnecessary duplication. Funnily enough, a solid percentage of the runs that were analysed in the top 2,000 actually did have double up classes in the comp. So while having good raid buff coverage is generally a good thing, even at this level, it didn't appear to be absolutely mandatory. The rarest DPS picks in this data were Mage, Shadow Priest, and Windwalker Monk. These classes did appear, but not very often. When they did, they were almost always surrounded by 4 of the other meta specs that fit in the normal comp. This is annoying, but also probably a good lesson. The rarer that your class is in the data at these high-level keys, the less experimental the group tends to be able to be. The main takeaway out of the DPS trio is that you don't need to run specifically Death Knight, Demon Hunter, and Evoker, but it's also that the comp is not completely open-ended. The successful non-meta comps still had a structure. Most of the time, they were keeping 1 or 2 of the DPS from the main meta comp, and then flexibly moving in classes like Warrior, Paladin, Warlock, Hunter, Rogue, Shaman, or Druid. For the players who are on even more uncommon specs, things like Devastation Evoker or Havoc Demon Hunter, don't fret, I haven't forgotten about you. These specs were extremely rare, but I don't think it's due to them having a lack of strength or raw output. I think it's mainly because of the fact that their counterpart specs of the same class were so dominant. We'll discuss a little bit later how these specs can still be successfully piloted in high-level Mythic Plus comps. I do want to highlight something pretty obvious as well. This data covers the highest level keys that the player base has currently completed. All of the runs fall within the top 0.1% of their respective regions. With this in mind, if your goal is to push for anything less than the 0.1% title, say the 1% mount, these principles will still work for building good comps, but they become much, much less rigid. For reference, all of the keys that I analysed were at minimum a plus 20, with 21 and above being the most common. If you are running a plus 16, effective comp building is still a good idea, but you can be much, much more lenient on the classes that you choose. And if you're doing something like a plus 12, just invite anyone, like seriously, literally anyone. This information is for those that are looking to build effective high-level push teams. Applying it rigidly to anything lower than that is just silly. It is worth noting that while the meta comp is clearly dominant, a less common but still very successful comp emerged within the data. This is what you would deem the physical comp. This pretty much always consisted of Brewmaster Monk and Restoration Shaman. This is mainly due to the fact that the comp relies pretty heavily on buff stacking, and Shaman Sky Fury is one of the more powerful buffs that they need. In saying that, we can use this framework to make some more offbeat comps a little bit later on, but we'll get to that shortly. The DPS combo for this team almost always contained a warrior DPS, with the remaining 2 DPS slots being filled out by Retribution Paladin, Feral Druid, Outlaw Rogue, and Hunter. I also believe that DK can fit into this comp, specifically Frost, but with the dominance of Unholy, that is something that doesn't really show up super often. Now, for those who are playing specs that rightly feel a little bit neglected in this top-end data, this is how we can use this information to incorporate any other spec. The important thing is to look at the structure of how these high-end comps work, and then figure out where your spec would best fit within an already proven framework. Let's say you're playing an Enhancement Shaman. The spec fits most neatly within a comp that would ordinarily need a Shaman buff, so the physical comp. What we can maybe do instead is replace the Shaman Healer with a Mistweaver Monk. We could then replace the Brewmaster Monk with a Bear, and then the DPS being a lineup of the Warrior plus one of the other Phys Comp members. This maintains all of the buff synergy that the comp requires, while also adhering to the framework that makes it work in the first place. Let's say we look at Mage instead. This class doesn't fit all that well within the physical comp. As a caster DPS, the best choice for a mage would likely to be to take the space of a Devourer Demon Hunter or an Evoker in the meta comp, as this is the cleanest parallel for the class itself. The thing to think about here is that if you are looking to push on a spec that hasn't been discussed, you need to look at the spec's overall identity and see how it might cleanly fit into comps which have already had proven success. I don't want to go over every single spec, but the data suggests that this is the most effective way of building a comp around less common specs. As a quick side note, our Mythic Plus competition in the community Discord server is currently full steam ahead, with nearly 4 million gold in prizes up for grabs. If you're interested in taking part, check out the link in the description below. This is open for both NA and EU regions. Many thanks to you, the viewer, for hanging out all the way until the end. As always, a huge shout out to my channel members and Buy Me a Coffee supporters, The Joy of Checks, Tobias, Yulem, and Is This Real at the Keystone Legend tier, and everyone else who I've shown on the end screen. You're the goats. Much love, gamers. See you all on the streets of Silvermoon. Until next time, take care.